Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello, listeners. Welcome to another episode of All Things Policies. I am Devyani, and I will be your host for today. Heat waves are becoming an increasingly common feature of our Indian summers, but extreme heat is more than just a seasonal discomfort. It affects public health, livelihoods, urban infrastructure, water resources, and economic productivity. As temperatures continue to rise, understanding why some places heat up more than the others and how we can build resilience against these impacts has become one of the most important policy challenges of our time. To help us explore these questions, we are joined by Dr. Nithyanandam, Professor and Head of the Geospatial Research Program at the Takshashila Institution, a leading expert in geospatial intelligence. Dr. Nithyanandam's research spans remote sensing, GIS analytics, urban informatics, climate resilience, and geospatial policy. Over the years, he has studied urban heat patterns in cities such as Hong Kong and several European cities, while also examining heat-related challenges across northern India and other vulnerable regions. He is the lead author of the Takshashila Geospatial Bulletin, a respected publication known for its research-driven geospatial insights, and a recipient of the prestigious Hong Kong PhD Fellowship. Thank you for joining us today. It is a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Devyani. It's my pleasure too.
All right. As we begin, my first question to you is that in your article, you argue that heat is fundamentally a spatial problem. What are the biggest limitations of relying on city level or district level temperature averages when assessing heat risk?
Right. See, heat is a much localized problem. So there are two categories. One can continue to argue on heat is something which is driven by global factors. The global warming brings up, heat towards our region and so on. That is one aspect. But to me, that is beyond our, possible control of it. The best way to control is to mitigate the heat which is generated from our own locality, our own sources. So while the global impact is on one side, there is a local impact also. So if we are trying to minimize the heat generation sources, for that we need to have a finer understanding of from where and what activity triggers the heat, right? For that, one need a precise measurement on ground. So right now, yes, there are multiple, you can say, the weather observations are happening, and weather stations are placed all across, the country. But let's say in a city, you have 4 to 5 weather stations, ideally placed closer to airports and part of meteorological observation offices and in few other places. And in district level, you can see it at, at taluk level, at least you can see it at, revenue offices and at district headquarters and so on. So can we have a better understanding? I'm not arguing that government should have thousands and thousands of automatic weather stations to precisely understand this phenomena in detail. At the same time, I'm also saying there should be a community which should engage and people should voluntarily report these things to a pool of platform, probably a unified geospatial portal kind of thing can be created for climate aspects also, and everybody feeds into it, and that gives a clear picture on ground. That would be more in order to understand the heat sources and to mitigate it as well.
All right. Thank you. That really helps us understand where the issue lies. And as we go ahead, my next question is India's weather station network has expanded significantly over the years. Yet you emphasized on the need for a denser local monitoring, right? So what critical information are we still missing with the current observation networks?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So what we actually miss out is the sources, right? As I said, if you look at the emission from ground, let's say every city behaves in a different way. You can see a point sources it comes from an activity which is being carried out in a city. There are certain common anthropogenic activity like vehicle emissions, building emissions, and the human emissions. But then that also varies based on the intensity of activities being carried out and then the sources. So for that, whether it is a city or rural, as I said earlier, one needs to have a precise understanding of where it is coming out. So it is not just, again, it is not just one value like temperature value. It is a combination of factors that helps us to understand the microclimatic variations in that area. So it could be temperature, humidity, wind speed, because some of them are helping us to identify the intensity of the heat source, and some of them are help us to understand the mitigating factors intensity also. Wind is a crucial factor for say. If there is no wind at all in a particular place, then the place has more complex challenges compared to a place which is highly ventilated, which has nice breeze and surrounded by water bodies and so on. So just by looking at temperature values, like what you are seeing these days in news and television, you can see people targeting about saying about red spots that looks very scary. But the point is, temperature is one factor. How do you feel is a different one, which is not just governed by temperature. Temperature obviously has a predominant role in it, but there are multiple other factors also.
All right. So now, going a little ahead, urban heat islands have become a popular term in climate discussions. So, from your research and your work, which urban characteristics build up this density, like vegetation cover, road networks, anthropogenic heat emissions, as you also mentioned, or something else? Which of them have the strongest influence on heat patterns in Indian cities, according to you?
Right. So first, let's understand what is urban heat island. So let's say 100 years ago or so, even before, the concept of urban heat island is known. And the very first study was carried out in London. And what it says is the entire urban area acts as an island. And the surrounding rural areas generally has a temperature value which are lower than the urban area. But that is a time when we study urban heat island from the lens of field measurements on ground, and people try to understand the temperature variation in different part of the city by traversing it, by using vehicles to traverse and to moving around and to have observatory stations across the cities. The situation has actually changed after 1980s, when the satellite started its observation over regions, and especially with the thermal payload. What it can bring is it can actually give us an instantaneous picture of an entire city. So typically it covers a city even to a district level also in a one single snapshot, where it gives you a clear picture of how the heat sources are spread up. But we should remember, when we are going on field, we generally measure air temperature, which is typically above waist height. That is what we feel, right? And then satellites, whatever it brings, those are all surface temperature. That's just below your foot. So there is a difference. One is actually the radiative temperature, which radiates and then it has impacts on us. The other one is, which is right, something we feel. So satellite gives us something, but it is not a direct measurement of how do we sense heat in a particular place. It is an indicative factor, but it's a quite effective factor. After that, we have so many studies which people could able to do it. So now what has defined in this new satellite based observation is the city is not just acting as a one island. There are many islands within the city. So urban heat island intensity tells us the city itself has so many pockets that requires a finer measurement. So that is what satellite data sets brought us this thing. And in Indian cities, this pattern of urban tend to be warmer compared to the rural areas is quite popular and similar. Let's say in European cities, it's where sometimes urban heat island helps them during winter because it reduces your heating needs. Whereas in our country, it is a big problem because it induces more electricity consumption. It impacts the thermal comfort of people, especially vulnerable communities like people who are working on roads, infants, elderly, and so on. So that's the difference I see. And then, interestingly, some parts of northern India you can still visualize through satellite data sets. The rural areas are quite warmer during day. So just because they are quite dry and the type of soil they have, it radiates heats back, and which impacts the environment at large. And this is about day. The similar intensity need to be studied at night, whereas the rural area may not have a challenge at night just because of, you get a better ambience at night. Whereas urban areas which are radiating heat from the walls, right, they still have a lot of impact to the people who lives there. And that is something where a concern late night, let's say 10 o'clock and above, you can feel the more heat in your house just because the buildings are started radiating towards it. This is about an urban Heat Island story. Whereas in this part of a country, it's definitely a challenge. Indeed, it's slowly a national security threat. That's how I could feel.
All right. So, as you said, there's a difference. So, there's often a gap between the temperature that is reported and the heat that people actually feel and they experience on the ground. So, how does geospatial data set help bridge this particular gap?
See, it is just because at times the placement of this observation post, right? Let's say the weather observation post lies above 1.5 meters in general. And largely, if you look at around the world, it's kept in a place where you can presume it is mostly giving us a 1 degree lesser temperature than the reality. What I mean is, you could see this observation post right in the middle of the public park or in an area which is cooler. And we have seen some examples in Delhi. It was on news earlier. People was sprinkling water around that closer to that area. So all what it tells us a temperature value which is lower than the reality, right? The moment we have more observatory stations driven by community, you will get a clear picture of it. So this is the challenge in observing this. But the moment we see it through maps, right? The moment we know where this observatory stations are located and what are the adjacent factors, that helps us to define. See, if we are putting one in a high dense area, if we are putting one in an open land, and then we know that this is a representation of a particular land use area or land use type which is surrounded in that observatory station, then it helps us to understand, okay, this is cooler just because it is surrounded by the mitigating factor. That helps us to study more precisely to work towards a proper mitigation factor, rather presuming that all the stations are indicating the real time temperature of the entire city, because we are going to scale it up. The reason is, here you're not measuring 100 points or 1,000 points within the city, you're measuring few points, and then we are presuming that that is an indicative of the entire city. And again, when it comes to national level, those values are measured in grids. Those are measured in boxes, and then values representing each of the grids were dropped into it. That again required in an accurate level in order to get a clear picture.
All right. So now many Indian cities have, in response, prepared heat action plans. So, in your view, what kind of geospatial intelligence is still missing from these plans, or what are the limitations that exist in these plans, and how can we overcome them?
I would differ here. I will not say that there are many, there are few. The reason for that is, any city can say we have a heat action plan, because heat is slowly getting noticed. It's not a visible threat, right? It's not something like a pollution that you can see through your eyes in Delhi. Heat is something where we all feel, but we never blame anybody in the local area just because we know it is something which is beyond our observation and nobody is burning anything here. It's something comes from a faraway place, or it's a nature that itself got changed due to climate change and so on. While part of that is true, but heat is still an invisible threat. And I would say how geospatial actually helps us, to map it better and to manage it better through effective heat action plan is like when a heat action plan involves mitigation factors. What largely cities tend to do it is to follow up one city which claimed it as something which worked marvelously for that area. They presume that a similar solution can be adapted and dropped into another city. That is something which I feel it's not a right solution, because here the observation come from satellite data which tells you which part of a city is warm based on the surface temperature, and then the mitigation factors are to minimize the radiative part of it, that is like whatever is being reflected from surface, right? But what we are trying to see here, to get an effective mitigation plan, it's not just about painting a roof in a with a white color so that you can get a cool roof and with better below. But what is required is something to find out a causative factor. The rooftop is one, but we need to figure out multiple other causative factors. One has to act on electricity consumption also. How we can minimize building emissions, how we can minimize appliances. See, for example, the people are tend towards buying five-star rated fans and appliances just because they feel electricity consumption is less. Yes, we should also start rating how should it impacts your environment in terms of heat, in terms of other factors. So those are critical things. But again, it is really important to understand what you have asked earlier is like, what are the contributing factors, right? As I said, building, humans, vehicles, land use, because when it is concretized, that is called impervious surfaces. When it become impervious surfaces, your heat is generally, which radiates back, but with a slow delay in it. There's a delay, bit of delay in emitting it back, but that again comes back to your environment. So all those need to be looked at in an effective heat mitigation plan. Few cities thought about it, but unless you put it in a GIS environment, right, and understand the locality better with climate as certain variables and the contributing factors and the necessary long-term sustainable solutions to mitigate it, unless we have this, right? If we start saying like, well, we will minimize the roof based heat emissions, we'll minimize certain things, it won't work. The heat emission plan will be effective the moment you start finding its root causes, and not just from space based observations. Increase the ground based observations and work along with the space based applications in terms of modeling, because it's quite easy to show a scary thing from remote sensing data. While I have used it for my initial understanding, my long term understanding on the problem says that is one component of your systematic process. You need more components to fit in.
All right. So when we map such heat vulnerability, how do we move beyond temperature data and incorporate social, economic, and demographic indicators as well, so that we identify those populations which are at risk?
Right. So this is why geospatial data is more critical. So the climate data becomes, or the weather data becomes one layer or couple of layers, and all the other factors like that, that they're exposed to heat and they do not have a mechanism to cool themselves, and they are on road. This includes traffic police for say. This includes people who are on duty on road. This includes a street vendor like the one who sells fruit, and one who runs a small shop on the road. All these people are vulnerable people, right? By understanding their age group, their comorbidities, one can figure out in vulnerable conditions. But then this is something which is difficult to do it at a large scale. But then that is why community collaboration really helps. So at least in Hong Kong, in our previous research, what we did, we mapped as vulnerable communities with the help of people. Indeed, there's a small set of device which can trigger alarm when they feel uncomfortable due to heat, were distributed to people whosoever has people above, let's say, 70 years of age or 80 years of age at their houses, and people who has infants. So let's at least try to find that, and people who voluntarily adapted those devices, and whenever they need help, they reach out to the relevant government department. That is to the level that we have to go, right? But if you're thinking that we are a large country and we cannot do it at this scale, at least we should start identifying the areas based on a set of people living there and their conditions and their exposure. Let's say water scarcity is a big challenge, right? In Delhi, you feel like you have pollution at one end, high rise temperature on the other end, and water scarcity on the third end. So all this combines create a huge challenge compared to somebody who lives in a area where it's quite hot, but they get all the facilities to manage it. So that is how geospatial data comes in, and it is really important to see it from those lenses, not just seeing heat as a separate issue.
All right. So, one of the key arguments is that heat mitigation strategies cannot be replicated from one city to another. Right. So, what are the most important local variables that policymakers should analyze before designing any kind of intervention?
See, the common known things here are, let's say, tree cover and the availability of water body and few other factors like what is the percentage of concretes on the city and so on. Where some are least known factors like how do you mitigate it? Do you have green buildings in your area? Do you promote green buildings? And how about the kind of appliances being utilized in these areas? And how about the spacing of buildings exist? Because that is again important for ventilation. How can we improve the thermal comfort of people walking on the road? So there are many minor factors that one should look into it, not just a classical ones.
Right. So, and in your work, how useful would high resolution thermal maps have been in identifying neighborhood scale heat hotspots that conventional weather observations usually fail to capture? So, how useful have they been?
See, I told this in the beginning to explain why thermal payloads are quite helpful, the high resolution imageries. But to add more to it, despite it is not going to give us the actual temperature of how we feel, it is indirectly derived. But then it is very important to give us an instantaneous picture. I know at 8 o'clock, or let's say at 11 o'clock, when a satellite passes, what is the scenario of different parts of a city? Because heat is a different, it's an instantaneous factor. The moment you measure heat at 8 o'clock in a place, and then if you go around to 10 o'clock to a different place, and you cannot compare it with what you had measured at 8 o'clock, because if it comes back at 10 o'clock to the same place, the temperature is completely different. That's because how the soil behaves, how the ambient temperature exists, and so on. So in that case, it's quite useful the moment you find out who is actually contributing. That is why the high resolution thermal payload, not limited to space based assets, even drone based or helicopter based thermographies at times helps, because you can map at building scale. You can see who is contributing at a rooftop, which part of the roof is actually contributing, why it is heat dissipating, can we do any mitigation measures. The works carried out in Canada, let's say a decade ago, that literally tells us how much it is impacting your own pocket. Like you emit heat and you don't care, right? Because that's how I need to make myself comfort thermally. But then if the picture puts out in a different way, saying the moment you emit this much heat, you are actually burning your own pocket by spending in an indirect way associated to your area. So that brings out some awareness, and people are cautious and people are ready to fix the problem. So that is where the importance of high resolution thermal mapping that comes from thermography indeed.
All right. So, looking at the current state of geospatial governance in India, where do you see the biggest opportunity? Better data collection, improved data sharing, or stronger institutional capacity, or greater integration of geospatial intelligence into policy decision? Where lies the biggest opportunity?
Well, I think this is the right time that we should go to a final level, just because we have a suitable geospatial policy which says do as much as geospatial work to find out how it is useful to people, and it promotes free data sharing, and that created an ecosystem, right? So the ecosystem is exist. Now it is up to the policymakers to see whether this can be useful to my people. If I bring some change, if I can reduce the temperature by zero point 0.5 degrees Celsius in my locality, one has to realize how much economically, how much in terms of comfort that zero point 0.5 degree reduction can change, right? And what are the measures that I need to take, and whether it impacts, if it gives us a benefit in a short term or in a long term, that also one needs to look at. So all this needs to be looked at by policymakers. And as you said, the cities have started looking at heat action plan, which can be part of an environmental plan. I would say cities should go for comprehensive environmental plans and then narrowing it down to heat as one of a major challenge, because it's, as I said in the beginning, it's an invisible threat. It affects our productivity. It affects people who are even works within the building. Unless you have a cooling mechanism, this affects our productivity at large. It affects our health at large, especially with people who has comorbidities. It largely affects infants and elderly. It affects even people in services. So armed forces, when it comes to move deployment of forces, when it comes to machineries, it's not just restricted to armed forces, it works even beyond. So anybody who is dealing with heavy machineries, all will have to suffer due to a temperature range. So what is in our hand while we are contributing to carbon credit and other missions, while we are contributing to the greenery percentage in the cities, we should also see how we can minimize the heat sources at city level. That is what more important is.
All right. So, last but not the least, you work at the intersection of climate science, geospatial technology, and public policy. So, what is one misconception that the public, or even the policymakers for that fact, continue to have about heat risk in India, and which of them needs to be challenged?
Well, I see this is going in our in our mind, set of people who are working on it for a long time. I have repeating this again in this platform. Let's say 10-15 years ago, the coastal districts in India faces heat waves extensively. And those days we used to hear news as like this many number of people, hundreds of people, thousands of people died in this areas. That's again overestimation at that time, because there's no proper way to mechanize the heat related impacts or account for heat related impacts. But today we are not seeing those kind of news. But again, I would say the heat impact is less accounted, and the health impact is recorded in terms of bacterial and viral infections during summer. And unless it goes to extreme heat related critical illness like death, people are very much unaware that the particular thing is triggered due to the heat stress, which is largely ignored due to the challenges in understanding heat related impacts. Though a doctor may initially understand, but the doctor would go for a the thing that got triggered because of it, and the heat stress, the foundational reason for that is often ignored. So maybe we should, if we can capture that properly, probably will know the severity of this problem and how it impacts. And also, when we translate the productivity laws, when we translate the other impact that it can cause to humans and even animals, then we can able to see this as a real national security threat, which requires a special attention, not just something, a solution that you can manage it for a shorter while in a part of a year and then you can get rid of it. This definitely require a deeper understanding.
All right. So, as we come to the end of today's discussion, it is clear that extreme heat is far more than a seasonal challenge. Understanding how it affects different places and communities requires better data, better planning, and a more localized approach to decision making. Thank you, Dr. Nithya, for sharing your valuable insights and expertise with us. It has been a pleasure having you on the podcast, and thank you for our listeners for tuning in. Thank you.
Thank you, Devyani, for having me today. It's indeed a pleasure to share some of our work.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle at Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.